I'm working with the tomatoes in my garden today because there's a lot to be done, from pruning to trellising to inspecting for disease and harvest. Join me today as I discuss tomato care mid-season. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is my beautiful black cherry tomato plant. Now, I'm growing tomatoes outside and in my greenhouse. So when it comes to defining mid-season, it really varies depending on whether you're growing inside or outside. But the way I look at it, it's about the time that the tomato plants are starting to flower and beginning to fruit. And one of the most important activities during mid-season is to harvest the fruit as soon as it's ripe on the plant. The more you harvest, the more you're going to encourage new, wonderfully tasting tomatoes. When the tomatoes ripen and are ready for harvest will vary based on the variety of the tomato. So this one right here, the Berry's Crazy Cherry, is all ready for harvest. And that's typical of cherry tomatoes. They tend to ripen earlier, whereas the bigger tomatoes, like this Kellogg's Breakfast, is probably still at least 3 weeks away from harvest. Now, you may already know that Eli and Kate and I are growing the same varieties in similar ways, like with these Oases boxes behind me. So let's check in with Eli. Eli, how has your harvest been so far?
Actually, our harvests have been pretty good. I came into this just a wee bit worried about the outdoor tomatoes and if I'd actually get any harvest off them at all. And I think because we had such a hot, sunny June, everything came on quite quick in that first month they were out. Now, the very first tomato we harvested was a Berry's Crazy Cherry from the greenhouse, but we actually only got, I think, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and then it was ages before we got any more. Whereas the tomatoes in the raised bed out in the garden, the Golden Nugget have been reliable and are probably the tomato I've had the most harvest of. I haven't had much in the way of the bigger tomatoes. I've had maybe 4 black Krim, 2 from out here and 2 from the greenhouse, and I've had a few of these. These are my Teton de Venus from the greenhouse. But in all honesty, the harvest has been better than I expected, and there's still loads to come.
That sounds really good, and it shows some of the similarities and some of the differences in your garden in Scotland and my garden in Colorado. The first tomatoes I got were in the greenhouse, but they were the black cherries. I put those in before anything else. But as for the tomatoes that we're growing together, the Berry's Crazy Cherry is the first tomato that I've harvested. In fact, tell you what, why don't you try this one? Here, Eli, give this a try.
Ooh, thank you. Ooh. That's quite good. Yours have got more flavour than mine. I wonder if that's because you get so much more sunlight. Hang on, I'll let you taste one of mine.
I knew she'd like mine better.
Right, try that one. Tell me what you think.
That tastes like a sweet million. That's really good.
Yeah, you like it? Excellent. I knew you'd like my tomatoes better.
One of the reasons I grow so many cherry tomatoes is because they're the first ones that ripen every year in my garden. So far, it's been the black cherry, the Berry's Crazy Cherry, and I do have a couple others. I have harvested a few of the Sun Gold and the Sweet Million, also cherry tomatoes. But I haven't harvested any of the black Krim or larger tomatoes that I'm growing in my garden. What I've been focusing on primarily up to this point, because I'm not harvesting, is the pruning of my plants. I've begun by pruning off all of the lower branches. All of the branches from about 12 inches down to the ground have been pruned off. This greatly reduces the chance of diseases, particularly those that are in the soil that might bounce onto the leaves when it rains or when I water. I'm letting some of these suckers grow into new plants. And I'm doing the same across the board, trimming off the lower branches and then allowing the plant to split into two primary stems. If new growth appears at the bottom, I go ahead and prune it off. I want to maintain all the air circulation at the base. And I do that with all of my tomato plants. Now, depending on how strong and sturdy the plant is, that first secondary branch may be higher off the ground. So this one is about 15, maybe almost 18 inches above the ground before I allow the tomato plant to split. As branches start growing in the wrong direction, these are growing away from the trellis, regardless of how big they are, whether they have flowers or like this one already has small tomatoes, I'll come in and prune off all of these branches. I want to keep the plant under control, growing horizontally and growing up my trellis. In my greenhouse with this black cherry, I've done the same. I've pruned off those lower branches and allowed the tomato plant to spread. This is more of a three-dimensional space, so I'm allowing some of the branches to grow in all directions and trellising up to the top. These are all almost 8 feet tall at this point. So Eli, how does this compare or differ to how you're pruning your tomatoes?
Yeah, I think exactly the same as with you then. In the early part of the season, the pruning was all about taking off all the lower branches, making sure there's lots of airflow, making sure that there's not going to be any branches near the soil so there could be splash onto them when you water. All the usual stuff we all do. And then getting further on, sort of beginning of July through July, it was all about trying to just manage because there was just so much going on. And whether it's outdoors or in the greenhouse, I do actually prune a bit more severely than you. I do restrict my indeterminate tomatoes to one stem. It's purely because I know our season's not quite as warm and sunny as it could be. It's not even as warm and sunny as the guys get down in England. So I'm doing everything I can to try and get as many ripe tomatoes at the end of the season as I can. So I don't want to let the plants have multiple stems and be growing too much fruit, as much as it pains me. So what I'm doing now in mid-August is I'm pruning now with the thought in my head of I need to make these plants focus on the tomatoes that are on them, getting them to size and getting them ripe.
That's a great example to show how our different climates and the different weather we have affects how we prune and manage our tomatoes. August for me is the ideal time for my tomato plants. They love my weather conditions. That's why I'm encouraging all this side and top growth, because I still have many weeks left to go before I have to start thinking about topping the plants like you are to direct their energy. I'm not so worried about the cold at this time of year and decreasing temperatures like Eli. I'm more concerned about weather like hail, which is one reason why I have this entire garden area covered with hail cloth. And the plants that are on the edges that don't have complete protection show signs of hail damage. Even the fruit, when it's hit by hail, gets some damage. And so one of my mid-season activities is keeping up with the weather forecast and keeping my hoops and trellises in place so that if a storm with damaging hail is forecast, I can come out and throw protection over the individual beds to try to minimize the damage to these tomato plants. And I'm inspecting my plants much closer in mid-season because they're bigger, they're growing closer together. Some of that air circulation that's beneficial begins to dissipate because there's just so much of the foliage growth. And so when I see a plant like this, I have to make a decision about what to do with it and if it's infected with a disease. This Hagen little yellow tomato plant is doing great, but the one right next to it is yellowed and the leaves are showing some damage. So I'm going to have to try to figure out what's happening. How about you, Eli? Do you have concerns about the disease in your garden?
So I don't know about you, but at the moment the UK is on blight watch. Everyone is absolutely terrified because we're just hearing stories everywhere of people's tomato crops being wiped out by blight. I don't know if that's an issue for you because you don't get the humidity we do. Now, I've never had it because I've never grown outdoors before, but let me tell you, I am nervous.
Well, I've never heard of getting a blight warning here in the States because early blight and late blight are very common throughout the US, and it's one of the things that most gardeners have to deal with. Now, I don't have blight in my garden, and I hope to keep it out, and hopefully, being the first time you're growing outside, you won't get blight. But as I inspect the leaves on this tomato plant, I think it might be Septoria leaf spot, which is caused by a fungus, or possibly bacterial spot, which is caused by a bacteria. I recently had a week of very cool conditions with a lot of rain. And like in Eli's case with the high humidity, that is what causes most of the tomato diseases we get. I'm guessing that's what I have with this plant. Whether it was caused by a fungus or a bacteria, it really doesn't matter. The solution is to remove this plant. So part of my mid-season care sometimes means ripping out the plants and throwing them away to try to keep the disease from spreading to the other plants. For many gardeners, mid-season is the time to fertilize your tomatoes. Now, with these beautiful black cherries and all of my tomatoes outside, I have not fertilized them because I spend so much time developing that healthy soil that I don't need fertilizer. The soil and the soil microbes are feeding my plants. But in containers like these Oasis boxes, I do have to fertilize. And I'm noticing in particular that these boxes are presenting me with plants that aren't growing as healthy as the outside plants or the other plants that are in my greenhouse. They're a little bit yellowed, a little bit lanky, and not giving me as much fruit. So, Eli, as you're looking at the plants we're both growing, what are you finding?
3 of these tomatoes are the same as Scott has grown. So we have my Kellogg's Breakfast, which has been my most disappointing tomato. Not because of its flavour, because I can't tell you about its flavour because I haven't had a single tomato from it. However, I've also got Black Krim, the same as Scott has grown. So I've got one here that is in my normal pot system. It's called a quad grow. That is doing okay. I have a second plant that's the one that's matching how Scott's grown. And it's this one here, and it's in an Oasis box. I also have a Barry's Crazy Cherry here in an Oasis box, and I have a Barry's Crazy Cherry here in my normal pot system. So comparing that then, I can say that my plants that are in my normal growing system are much, much bigger than the plants in the Oasis box. They're just much healthier looking. They're much a deeper green. The ones in the Oasis box, I find in Scotland we say peely-wally. It means they're just a bit pale and anemic looking. But also, they're just not producing the way the other plants are.
That's interesting that our weakest plants for both of us are growing the same way. I have some ideas. I think it's a little early to figure out just exactly why that is, but we'll save it for the next video as we look at the end of our season and try to figure out what went right and what went wrong. One of the other activities that I'll do now, that I always do mid-season, is to take my tomato clips and trellis up my tomatoes. So even though these are the weakest plants, they still need trellising. As do all of the rest of my tomato plants. Keeping the tomatoes under control and trellised begins at the beginning of the season, continues through mid-season, and will last until the end of the season when, like Eli, I'll top these plants to keep them from growing any higher and to direct their energy into the harvest. To see what Eli is doing in her garden, go ahead and watch this video next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.